This is the third week of a bit of an update on coronavirus and the effect on your money. And so I'm going to try and keep it a bit shorter this week. I've just got my phone here that I've started a timer on. So I've actually started that just now. So I'm going to try and keep it to 10 minutes, which is 5 minutes on the coronavirus and then 5 minutes on your money. And so, first up, I just want to acknowledge that I do think this is a really big problem. And I want to acknowledge that the people who are probably going to watch this and people that I know are absolutely more affected than, maybe not the average person, but they're right in the direct line of sight of this virus. And so I don't want to minimize any of sort of that position, what's happening, and those sorts of things as far as that goes. So, but what I want to do is just introduce a couple of different points because I feel like there's a lot of noise around and that we're just basically bracing for a tsunami. And so I think it makes sense to prepare for a tsunami, but I just want to talk about sort of some different things that haven't really been talked about or just being talked about around the fringes. And so the first one is basically there could be a lot more asymptomatic people floating around than have been tested. And so the testing numbers and the people that are actually carrying the virus could be dramatically higher. So there's been a little bit of talk about this, but not really kind of anybody giving any magnitude for it. And so there's a few, I suppose, signs on, whilst that might be right, and the countries that are tending to test more are having dramatically lower death rates. And potentially, conceivably managing a little bit better. So if we look at Germany, for instance, they have 267 deaths on 43,000. Now, whilst that is, I'm certainly not trying to minimise deaths, but when you think about Italy and what we were thinking maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, then what ended up their deaths are. And I think that people that are just putting, this is where Italy was 2 weeks ago, this is where we were, and just kind of keep going the day to day to day, it's a lot more complicated than that. And so it's not black or white, there is some grey there. And so, there's a thought process going around. I'm 2 minutes into my five. There's a thought process going around that the denominator is dramatically higher. And so the Australian government and the UK government have basically ordered a ton of kits to try and identify or to test people to see if they have antibodies in the next period of time to the coronavirus. So not testing to see if they have it, but testing to see if they have had it and they didn't get a coronavirus test. And what they're trying to do is get a better handle on what the denominator is. So what's the denominator? I have given you a little quick cheat sheet here. Basically, when you're dividing something, so 1,000 into 100,000, the number on the bottom here is the denominator. So if we had 1,000 deaths in 100,000 cases, it's 1%. But if we had 1,000 deaths and there's actually 500,000 floating around in the population, then the death rate is 0.2. And so whilst I'm not minimising the deaths, I'm trying to introduce that the virus might not be as lethal as we had previously thought. And so we might be able to get on top of it in an easier manner or a more manageable manner. And so there's this excellent article, well, I think it's excellent, in the Spectator magazine that's coming out. It's going to be published next week. But basically, they're going in there, and it's a pathologist who's written up the article. But, one key thing is when Britain had 590 diagnosed cases, the government's chief scientific advisor suggests that the real figure is probably between 5 and 10,000, 10 to 20 times higher. If he's right, the headline death rate due to the virus is likely to be 10 to 20 times lower than what people had originally thought it could be. And so I think that is some perspective on it, and I hope that is right. There's a number of other kind of things that are floating around now. There's been a couple of papers written on that. It appears as though warmer climates have less complicating factors from COVID or less polluted climate. So the rate of infection is the same, but the ravaging on the population could be less. And so rather than me continue to talk about that, I'm going to link to this article. And I actually think these guys, Precure, are doing a really good balanced approach about looking at the science that's coming out and giving you some information on that, and really, I think, trying to get a bit of balance in some of the information that's coming out. They're Kiwis. So for those who don't know, I have New Zealand heritage as well, so I do have a soft spot for them. But I'll link to sort of like it's doctors and public health professionals and scientists and academics, and so they're out of New Zealand. They've got nothing to do at the moment because they're in complete lockdown, other than put time into this stuff. And I think they're doing a really good approach at it, from looking at what's happening with the virus. Here's some things about it. What do we know? What do we feel like we are more confident on now? And also just some tips about how to think about it and manage your mental health and some of those sorts of things. And so I have a bit of a habit of getting a little bit too involved into it. And so I've done a separate video on that I think is I'm really happy with. So I'd encourage you to read that as well. If I'm looking down here, down there, it's because that's where the video is. And for some reason, I tend to look at myself rather than looking at the camera. So I think just a really quick summary on that is that, yes, it's a problem, but it's not black and white. It's complicated, and it might not be as bad as we had thought. I hope it is not as bad as we think. And so, if that is the case, then yes, there'll be a better health outcome for people, but also there's going to be potential less longer-term effects on the markets. Okay, and so that's kind of, I've gone through 5 minutes. So the next thing is on your portfolio and your money and markets. And so, I think we now need to entertain the possibility of sort of 3 scenarios. One scenario is we get on top of this really quickly, and then we have a really quick bounce, and it's all fine. And I've got a little kind of presentation that I had seen that kind of gives you a bit more perspective on that. So the 3 scenarios are: lockdown's lifted, we've had a shallow trough and it gets going, 3 to 6 months. This is my hope. Okay, so that's where I'm hoping at the moment. There's a major disruption and unemployment spike. US jobs figures are through 3 million unemployed now, and Australia, if you look at a couple of tweets floating around, it doesn't take it very hard to realise that, this is some major companies have laid off all these employees for the moment. Then you've got every cafe, shut down, every hospitality business. So there would have been half the people on Monday. Through here, there's 65,000, half the people on Monday, and that's going to be at least 1 million. Now, 1 million Australians in the workforce not working. The workforce is something like 12 million. So one in 12 people not working is not good for the economy. Like no matter which way you put it. So I think that is a significant risk. And if we tend to, if it goes on for longer than 3 to 6 months, then we're going to have some problems. Okay, so there's going to be some more debt markets will freeze. Stimulus is going to take time. So this is government stimulus, and we're going to have negative growth for a couple of years. And so I think, I'm optimistic on this scenario, and I don't think that's like being optimistic. I think that is still probable. And this is less likely. This is increasingly less likely, I think. So I think that is still probable at the moment. One thing I just want to talk about with your money is when we look at the GFC and how things happened. Apologies about jumping through a few charts. But, volatility is going to stay there when people have no visibility. So they can't see what's going. The news is continuing to be negative. But what did we learn out of the GFC is that markets, and I've touched on this point, that they will start recovering when the news is still bad. So March 2009 was when we had the GFC lows. The US economy shrank for another 6 months. So it went backwards for 6 months before employment started growing. GDP didn't turn positive for some time after, and the market had already gone up 57% before GDP turned positive. What's GDP? That's just the country starts growing again. Okay, and so this is a graphical explanation, which is probably a bit easier to get, but that is like basically nothing. You've got negative GDP, so the country's contracting, but the share market has started to go up here. Okay, and then from when we go from there to there, that's a 57% return. And so I just am feeling like I still think The next couple of weeks, there's some bad news to come as America gets a bit more clear about exactly what's going on and where they're at on their side. I think, they just haven't been testing. They haven't had kits. So it is dramatically worse there than what we think. New York is in for a really sort of tough time. I do think that I completely see that their health system is a complete mess. But putting that aside, I do think that as a country, they probably can respond to stuff extremely well. And so I think I hold out that. I still want it to be, shallow, to be honest, but I'm preparing for more of the medium. So just a last little bit of perspective. Where are we at with so far? If we look at the last 100 years, we are in one of the fourth worst years ever in the last 100 years, and that gives you a bit of perspective on markets. This blue stuff is what we want, and what you tend to find is if you have a horrific year over here in 2008, somewhere in here you'll be able to find 2009 floating around. There you go, 20 to 30%. 2010 will be like also a good year. So you tend to find that the years following a very bad year are very good years. So I just thought that's a little bit of perspective. That's a bit about your money. So on the balance of everything, if you'd asked me on Monday of this week, I was pretty glum. Yeah, so I was pretty glum. But as I've looked at it a little bit more, looked at some information, I do think there's the stuff with the government. Australia really hasn't gone far enough. In the UK and in New Zealand, a number of other countries, the government basically giving everybody 80% of their wage until they get back. So that is a significant. Australia might have to go deeper. America's not doing that, of course. But I think economically, it's going to get worse. It feels worse than the GFC. But on the health side, I think that there are some more, like maybe, we talked about Wuhan last week. Maybe there's a little bit more information there that might not get as bad. And if it doesn't get as bad, then economically it won't be as bad as well. We are essentially crashing the economy at the moment to try and deal with this. Whether that's the right approach or not, I'm not 100% sure. I'm definitely not black or white. I think it's grey and it's complicated. But history will show us what is right. But from what we can think about, it's the same things. Put a little bit more money in there now. Don't go crazy. In the next period of time, be prepared to do more and that sort of stuff if you're in those positions. So that's my roundup. Thank you for the feedback from those people who are giving me feedback. It really does make a difference. I'll link to a couple of those things. And then for your individual situation, let me know. Of course, happy to talk about it. Thanks, man.